So the gear that I have in front of me right now is what I would typically bring with me out in the field to document wildlife in nature. And here, especially in Hornstrandir, where I'm focusing on photographing and filming the Arctic fox. So the main body that I use is the Sony Alpha 1 with a 400mm f2.8 lens. I find that most often I'm on the 400mm lens because of the size of the body of the Arctic fox and the distance that they typically are from me at any given time. Because the Arctic fox is quite comfortable with my presence and they do oftentimes come closer because they are curious, the 400mm lens is sometimes too close. So that's why I have a 70 to 200mm lens on my second body for when they do come within a few meters. If the Arctic fox is much further away, I'll use the 400mm lens with the 2x teleconverter, and as they approach, I'll take the teleconverter off, and if they get even closer, I'll use the 70 to 200 on my alternative body. Because of the long distances that I sometimes have to travel to film and photograph the Arctic fox, the weight of the 400mm lens can be a bit too much. So in order to solve this problem of weight, I am often bringing with me just the 70 to 200mm lens, which I use in combination with the 2x teleconverter, which creates a 400mm lens and is actually already just close enough for me in most situations. In addition to focusing on the wildlife, filming and documenting the birds and the Arctic fox here in the nature reserve, I'm also using a 20mm f1.8 lens and a 50mm f1.8 lens to document the surroundings as well. I don't use these lenses as often on the wildlife here because the Arctic fox and the birds don't get as close as these lenses can allow, but I use these lenses to document the grand scale of the landscape when I am close to the mountains and to the cliffs here in this area. Because the Sony Alpha 1 is capable of both incredible photography and filmmaking, this is the main body that I'm using most of the time out here in the field. Now, in order to stabilize the shots that I am doing for filmmaking, I'm using this Manfrotto video tripod head. And what's a little bit different on this specific trip is that I find myself using the video tripod head more often than normal, even for photography, because I find that it's a lot easier to move and pan and track the Arctic fox, as they are pretty sporadic animals moving from one place to another as they scratch and forage around on the beach. So in order to capture the environment that I am in right now, both for photography and for filming, I am using the DJI Mavic Air 2 drone. And on days like today, I'm using the Polar Pro ND filters to help stop down the light in order to get smooth and cinematic film of the landscape. So in addition to my wildlife footage, which is filmed on these camera bodies and these lenses, the In the Field series is primarily filmed on the Sony FX6 body and DZO film Vespid prime lenses and Kata zoom lenses. And special shout out to Frank Nievenhuis, who has been the primary filmmaker in this series, filming me doing all kinds of things out in nature with animals. What's also important to note is that prior to coming to Hornstrandir, I actually applied for a film and photography permit. Through the filming permits I was granted, I was given access to fly in certain designated areas, and other areas are prohibited to protect the birds that nest on the cliffs and the foxes that den in specific valleys in this region. Hornstrandir is an extremely remote place. There's no internet accessibility, there's no mobile networks, there's no electricity, and running motors or engines are actually limited and prohibited in most situations. Here behind me I have a gear tent, which we have all of our electronics set up for charging, and we have a generator that we can only run during certain hours of the day actually to charge our batteries. So if you are going out to film and photograph wildlife out in nature, I do recommend that you research ahead of time if there are any guidelines that you should follow or permits that you need to apply for. I also want to thank the team at Adorama for helping to facilitate projects like this that allow me to document wildlife in nature. And a special shout out to Erwin and to Sal for your continuous support.